where it's placed. Notting Hill had a specific demographic, and now the demographic that's there right now, they're like, it's too much noise, it's too much noise. And I'm like, girl, do you know where you are? Like, close the window, go out of town for a day, like, do what you need
Book
to
your
do.
vacation,
Like,
babe.
yeah,
Like, it's fine.
Yeah.
it happens every year. And now there's like this pushback to like quell it. And
I'm fed up and sick of you. Don't lead me on again. Don't act no more. I feel nothing for you. Just leave me alone.
Hi everyone, I'm Stacey Lee Kong, and this is Friday Things, Take It to the Group Chat, a video series where I assemble the real-life equivalent of a group chat, a panel interview, to talk about different aspects of the immigrant experience. And today, I'm so excited because we're talking about Caribana and Caribbean culture with, I have to say all the things, writer, production designer, and art director Sharine Taylor, and writer, artist, educator, and academic Ryan Persadie. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with like a bit of a scene setting. So Sharine, I think when we talk about the perception of Caribana, there's like the masqueraders' perspective, there's the organization's perspective, there's the government, there's like industry. So can you kind of take me through the various perspectives? Like, what do you think each of those groups are thinking about Caribana? And like, how valid are they?
so I believe people who work in government are largely thinking about economic impact. So what is this going to cost us and the revenue that it brings in? But I believe in addition to economic impact, just impact in general, how much space is this going to take up, what cleanup is going to look like, how many of our own resources we're going to have to allocate to facilitate what this is. Space has been a very touchy subject here, and how we've been moved and located. So I think that's probably what they're thinking of. I think masqueraders largely are thinking about just the idea of doing it, like being able to do it and having access to do it. Costumes, of course. We have a very unique problem in Toronto, which are stormers. So just like how that is
Right.
going to affect people's engagement with that. Not so much a topic recently, knock on wood, but like safety and things of that
Yeah.
nature. Just making sure that folks can engage and gather in a way that feels good. I know music is a hot topic as well. And I think more recently, people have also been trying to figure out or question or interrogate, like, what does this mean to us? How far away from our roots we've strayed, or
Yeah.
what's been retained. And yeah, I think that those are some of the things that masqueraders are thinking about. Did I miss a group of people?
You did. I was gonna say,
Okay.
and what about
Yeah.
and yeah, so industry, like those organizations that increasingly I think see an economic value in partnering with or being associated with. Sometimes that's like really big sportswear companies. Like there's lots of companies that are paying more attention. It seems like to me.
Right.
But I'm really interested to hear what you're thinking.
Brands that are interested in collaborating are definitely thinking about more meaningful ways to
Yeah.
collaborate. But I think that the other side of like brand collaboration is like when you have this event or this procession or this tradition that is so rooted in resistance, so integral to how people have articulated what it means to be liberated and things of that nature. I think that it can get pretty sticky because, like, why do you want to be here?
Literally.
Like, there's a lot of benefit for you, sure, and we know that, but like, what are your intentions? And I think that people are, at least the conversations that I'm having in my group chat, are asking about, like, if we see a brand that is just kind of like, why are you here? It's like really like saying that out loud. And then I think a lot of people who are carnival chasers as well, or like who enjoy going to carnivals, they're thinking about the experiences here versus in other places.
Yeah.
And a lot of those brands are able to facilitate that, but also a lot of those brands are just here for a good time and not a long time. And I think that's worth raising the eyebrow about. And then I guess in terms of industry or things that might be part of that are the people that are supposed to be championing this cause. Like, what are y'all here for? And how are y'all continuing to make sure that we are operating the way that we're supposed to, and that's in service to this tradition that has like always been referenced as like North America's largest street festival, a fair, party,
Right.
gathering. But like, look at all the stuff that we've gone through, and how we were able to get here, and what's the future of it.
Yeah. Lots of competing interests, it feels like, and lots of points of tension, especially between the politic of this thing that we're talking about and the history and I want to come back to that idea of liberation for sure, and then the economic and business interests. So, Ryan, how do you think these perspectives, and especially the way that they play or don't play together, how does that shape how Caribana actually happens?
Right, and I think like what Sharine is opening up is like this context of like multiculturalism
Yes.
that Caribana sort of emerges out of, right? So we know that like in the 1960s, Afro-Caribbean folks in the community were actually trying to resurge carnival as a sort of cultural resource, right? But it sort of comes at a moment like 20 years after sort of multiculturalism is introduced or as like an official Canadian policy, right? So I think a lot of the tensions you're speaking to about like, say, there have been debates around non-soca genres being in carnival in Toronto, right? Where people have said like, well, why is there dancehall here? Why is there Afrobeat here? Or even in I think the late 90s, early 2000s, like there was articles being written about why rap was being played as part of this space, and not to sort of disavow or negate the political influences or the political significance of those genres, but to create a specifically Afro-Caribbean space for Afro-Caribbean community that had contributed a lot to sort of the landscape of Toronto and the larger GTA, right, and Canada more broadly. But
Yeah.
I think a lot of those multicultural tensions, multiculturalism creates a sort of a warped version of what Caribana was made for, right? And I think even specifically like as an Indo-Caribbean person, I think we have to remember, like, in speaking back to my community, that like we were invited, right?
Yes.
Even for ourselves. So like I come from a Christian Indo-Caribbean family that had deep ties to Blackness because of the ways in which Christianity sort of held our communities together. So like when my father immigrated here in the 1970s, like that was one of the first things he did to sort of name his Trininess was like play. And Caribana was very different in the 70s, right? And the way that
Yeah.
it was sort of performed and what it was enacted. But I think a lot of the tensions that we're experiencing now obviously have to do with corporate sort of investments, state investments, Caribana being celebrated as North America's #1 festivity. And I hate that word because I'm like, carnival is not it's a festivity, but that's a...
But it's not,
You know,
even when we talk about it as a street festival, it's like, sure, I guess if you want to go by a dictionary definition of,
Yeah.
like, it's a parade, but it's not,
Really, that's not really what it's doing.
it is.
Yeah.
Yes, those tensions are so at play.
Totally. And I think even in, I'm very conscious about who I play with. I
Same.
play mass every year, but there's certain bands that have been accused of anti-Blackness. There's certain bands that have been accused, and I'm a queer person as well, so I also think about when I go with my queer friends. I've never had an issue at Caribana. I think there's a lot of stereotypes of Caribana being a dangerous space, largely because of ideas around anti-Blackness and
Yeah.
criminalization and those sorts of things. But I also think about if I'm going with a group of queer and trans people, like where are we going to feel the most comfortable? And I've always played with Carnival Nations, and I've always had a really good time. Like, y'all have bent me over on the road. Like, it's not...
Yeah.
People are always like, oh, I can't believe you do this as a queer person. And I'm like, there's so many queer people in
Yeah.
Caribana, right? And even
Yeah.
when you go to the Caribbean, like, when you think about Carnival, Carnival is about a loosening
Yeah.
of
Yes.
these rules, right? So, men are dancing upon men, women on women, people are, feeling really loosey-goosey, and that's what Carnival is supposed to help us to do temporarily, is to sort of get outside of the structures of violence that we're so caught up in. But I feel like sometimes in a multicultural context, we as Caribbean people go there to like access spirit, or we go there to act, and I mean the spirit of Carnival, right? There's sort of that feeling of liberation, whereas, some people go there because they think it's a party. Right? And Carnival is something that was like gifted to our communities, right? As a practice of liberation, as you were talking about, right? But I think, when corporate agendas become tied to something like this, the like deeply anti-colonial and political nature of what happens sort of gets kind of diluted.
Yeah. Who do you think Caribana is for?
Well,
I feel like it's about to get so much spicier than it's been so far.
so like the Caribbean itself has a multitude of like ethnicities and nationalities, and Jamaica has decided to make that a core part of its identity with its motto, out of many, one people, despite the country being 97% Afro-Jamaican, but I digress. Because people are aware of that knowledge and because that is a reality, I think when we are moving towards a diaspora and how we engage in our tradition, I feel like that multicultural element is kind of like exploited because what ends up happening is people are assuming that multiculturalism now is an invitation for everyone to be a part of it. And I think that that is a complex relationship that we have with our traditions that are often turned into tourism products. But when I'm thinking about who it's made for, I don't know if there's like a clear answer because in my head, it's like it's made for Caribbean people in theory and the diaspora, and it's a way that we continue traditions like how other cultures continue traditions on this new land that they're at. But because of what it is, and because of what it has been made to be, and because of how people have attached themselves, or brands or entities have attached themselves, and because of a varying list of agendas, I think it's moved from like the private to the public. Many of our liberation practices in the Caribbean took place on the street, just because like you can't police the street in a way that you can like these private places. And continuing the tradition of where we've accessed our liberation in the streets here in this new land, it takes on a whole new meaning because there's like policy involved, right? Loitering, if you want to be a vendor at Caribana, you gotta do the bureaucratic thing. You gotta get paperwork, you gotta get this, all this stuff and whatever. So there's all of these like things that contort the way that we celebrate despite our doing our very best to try and retain as much of it as we can on this new land, in this new place. I think it's supposed to be for Caribbean people, but it's been made for everyone else to share our culture. And then I think we just get lost in all of that because now there's all these opinions and things. I remember like in 2019, I'm so certain I saw Six Buzz was supposed to have a truck. Like I'm so absolutely certain that that was like a thing that was happening. And I was like, oh, this is a very interesting element.
Interesting is such a nice way of putting it.
It's a very nice way of putting
Because
it.
my first reaction was yuck.
But that's what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Like this thing that is like, it's so clear to me what the intentions of Carnival is and how we celebrate it through Caribana here. And then that it's been made so accessible for everyone to shape it into what it needs to be for them really bothers me.
Yeah. I think a lot about welcoming people to participate. I don't even know. Like I'm not quite sure what the words that I'm looking for are because it's like I want people to understand and love and see my culture. I want you to enjoy it, but I don't want you to try and take it over or own it. Like I want you to have that basic brought-up-see to say, oh, this isn't my thing, I'm a guest here. And I do wonder, so I'm a very mixed Caribbean person. I can't pinpoint, I can tell you what the ethnic groups I belong to are, but they're not, like I'm often a guest in many spaces. And so I feel like that has been such a foundational part of my experience of Caribbeanness. And culturally, I think that's what we do, is like you can't be from very mixed places and not understand the push and pull of being a different identity in that space. So then to have other people feel like entitled to instead of behaving like a good guest, I find very frustrating, sometimes centered on individual people, but also in a broader way. Ryan, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think, a lot of, what we're talking about is like what happens when a very local practice that's grounded in like a deep genealogy of like liberational politics gets sort of like deterritorialized and then like re-territorialized and taken from a place and then inserted into this whole other context, right? I'm thinking also about like a lot of the debates that were happening. I forget, this was like maybe 2019 when a lot of Indigenous communities were talking about, what is happening, because a lot of our regalia is deeply indebted to Indigenous communities as well in the Caribbean. And there were a lot of sort of tense debates around, I think there was one particular band, and it was during Canada 150. So there were a lot of
tense time as well.
Yeah, so there were a lot of conversations around, stolen land and settler colonialism that obviously the Caribbean is very invested in, right? But there was sort of, these conversations around, are we appropriating as non-Indigenous folks, right? Are we appropriating, or when it becomes recontextualized in a sort of another space of settler colonialism, like how do we negotiate those tensions and actually build solidarity in that space?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that also becomes really complicated too. It's interesting, like now, even though the Caribbean is a very Indigenous space, it often gets read as a non-Indigenous space, where
Yeah.
nativeness doesn't get talked about
Yeah.
in the same way, despite it being a site of indigeneity, right? So I think, even to add to, like, it's not just about, say, tensions we experience with, say, those in positions of power, but also tensions we experienced with, like, the other forms of marginalized communities, right? Who
Yeah.
are, we are able to be here because they've allowed us to be here. Me and Sharine were actually just talking about this before this started, right? Thinking
Yeah.
about, what does it mean, like, say, for me as a non-Black person, being invited to take part in a deeply Black feminist space while also still living on stolen land, right? So there's all these, like, layers of
Yeah.
hegemony that are happening at once, where it's like, I will have my own accountability, right? And for a Black person, that may be very different, or an Indigenous person who's, whatever, right? But I think that's what Carnival is asking us to think about, is to think about, like, what is our relationship to place, right? Like, why are we showing up in this moment? Like, why are we being called to the road, right? Like, whenever me and my friends play, we always play out of urgency, because it's like we need to be there. Like, there's something about the spirit of Carnival that, like, you can't access in other places, right? I think that's, like, a lot of what we go for, is we go for that, like, deeply, and whether it's ancestral or emotional or whatever you want, spiritual, whatever you want to call it, but, like, we are going for that, like, we're being called to it in a particular way. And I think for non-Caribbean people, they're not being called to Carnival in the same way, right? They may see it and want to participate, but they have a different embodied experience to it, right?
Yeah, I think they're being called by Instagram.
Yeah. Because, every time I play Mass, like, one of my really good friends, like, me and her always talk about, like, how, like, we cry together when Soca plays.
Yeah.
Like, I remember, like, last year when Come Home came on, which is, like, one of my favorite
Yeah.
songs, right?
Yeah.
Like, all of us were sitting there, like, obviously, like, a little intoxicated, feeling the vibe.
The emotions
but
were close to the surface.
all of us are
to
just,
be
like,
fair.
holding each other crying. And I was like, this doesn't happen outside of Carnival.
Right.
No.
Right? Like, there's something about the music and the space and your bodies moving together that creates this, like, deeply sacred experience. And it's hard, I think, for non-Caribbean people to understand that.
So when you were talking about feeling called to the road, I think I actually feel called to other Caribbean people. Like, for me, I think it is especially frustrating for me to feel defensive of Caribana and Carnival in general when I'm talking to people who perceive it as, like, a deeply party focused or sexual or sexualized space. And for me, it's like the idea of liberation is so core to that, like liberation in my body, liberation in what is for me, liberation in terms of, like, who I belong to and where I belong. So what does Caribana and Carnival mean to both of you? And we've kind of, like, talked about it in every question, but just to, like, crystallize that.
I remember, like, when I was 18, I, like, begged my mom, like, I'm like, please let me go. Please, my friends are literally all going. And, like, I begged her every year. And then when I was 18, she'd finally said yes. And I went, like, as a plainclothes, like, person. This was the time when they had those high fences. And I remember we, like, came down and, like, I just remember there was 6 of us. We were all looking up at this fence. And we just kind of all looked, like, at one another, and we just started climbing.
Yeah?
And, like, just no conversation, just, like, climbed up the fence. This one girl nearly, like, broke her foot. But we got over, and then we just had a time. Like I just remember us, like, going out and just, like, really, really getting to access this feeling of, like, belonging. So for many ways, for me, like, engaging in Carnival, but specifically Caribana, was like a rite of passage. And I just remember that event, like, so many things happened. Like, it was the most chaotic thing I had ever been to in my life. That was the first time I ever experienced, like, a network shutdown. Like, I was, like, literally calling out for my friends, like, to see who would, like come to me and stuff like that. We were, like, broken up. We found each other, broken up, found each other. Like, it was so wild. But that is, like, such a core memory of, like, youth, of, like, specifically Caribana, and just, like, really being able to have a place where I can, like, reaffirm my Caribbean identity. But then as I started writing
And thinking.
and just, like, really understanding carnival and like Caribana as a regional practice and something
Yeah.
that has been recreated in diaspora. And like specifically reading about carnival in Trinidad, like I'm really, really thinking about like what the ancestors of that space did with their free time. And I think that it's so important to remember that liberation does have this huge, broad definition, right? So folks were like, this is our time. Usually it's tied to like the end of a like harvest or like this is really our time to do like what we want to do. And that is gonna look different for everyone. Like we're very much talking about pretty mass and stuff like that. But I
Yes.
love the traditional characters because I think that traditional characters remind me of liberation of gender, liberation of performance aesthetics. But then I think about like the Jamettes who are just like, we're gonna do what we want because we can. This is our body and that's what I'll deal with. And I think because it takes on such a broad definition, for me, carnival has always been that. Like, it's like the place that I'm most free. Obviously, I know that the mode of celebration has changed. Like, it's still a tourism product at the end of the day. So sometimes how we engage in it is different. But I
Right.
do always think about like, oh my God, like our ancestors were just doing this because they felt that urgency that you're talking about. Like they really were like trying to make the most of that time, in whatever way that looks like. And we have like a version of it and we get to access that and it feels just so imperative. Like it's so imperative for me to like participate in it. I mean, I know what it means to me, but I do hope and pray that when people are deciding to engage in it and they might not have those roots, that they are really trying to read and understand and learn and educate and maybe sometimes make the decision like, this is not for me. I'm gonna sit back and watch. I really hope that that spirit of discernment ascends on them sometimes. But also in the same breath, like carnival is not like a Jamaican practice. Like that is very important.
Right.
So even acknowledging like that like location for myself and saying like, okay, even as a Caribbean person, I still have to engage respectfully in the ways that carnival or Juve happens in Trinidad, Juve happens in Grenada, Juve happens like I still feel like I'm a guest sometimes. I know I'm a guest sometimes, and so I'm really engaging in those things with as much like respect or veneration, but also acknowledging that our shared history and being in that region ties us together, and I can appreciate the way that liberation takes a different form through the procession of carnival.
Yeah. Ryan, what is especially I think from the perspective of a queer person, what is the meaning of carnival for you?
I grew up like going to Caribana, so like even like I grew up in a very like soca family, right? So like that was like calypso and soca was like how I was introduced, I think, to my Caribbeanness.
Yeah.
And people hold soca as a very like hetero genre, but it's really not. When you really
No.
think about what soca is offering.
When you listen to the lyrics?
Yeah. And when you really think about, Carnival produces soca,
Yeah.
right? And when you think about what soca is doing, soca is teaching us what would it mean to feel like in your body, to exist outside of normatizing structures or the normal, what is seen as the gender normal, the racial normal, citizenship normal. I mean, this is why people go to Carnival, is because they want to break free. Like even the concept of like free up yourself, right?
Yes.
Is like take yourself outside of the constraints, right? So I think for a queer person, it directly ties to how we sort of navigate the world. Because I always tell my students like queerness is like a divine gift. Because no one asked to be queer, right? Most people don't come out of the womb wanting to be queer, right? But we are sort of gifted it, and then we start to, because we're not seen as we're not seen as part of the norm, we have to reorient our relationship to normalcy, right? So we have to reorient our relationship to like, what does monogamy mean? What does love mean? What does desire mean? What does it mean to be part of a family? Because your queerness takes you outside of those normative structures, right? And Carnival does something very similar, right? In that it was made to sort of undo the system, right? For a temporary moment, right? But I think, for me, Carnival is also a place in which I get to access like sort of this genealogy, this tradition that I've been invited into, right? And I think for me also, as I was saying, like I didn't grow up as a Hindu or a Muslim, which is how most narratives around Indo-Caribbeanness are tied to, right?
Yes, same.
I like grew up with a particular form of Christianity that was very much tied to blackness,
Yeah.
right? And so, and you know, a lot of my work is around the relationship between the Indo-Caribbean and blackness and all those sorts of things. And so, yeah, I see myself as sort of a guest in the space, but I've been able to access so much of who I am as a person through Carnival, right? Like even when my grandmother was alive, she told me like the first thing she did when she was 19 was she ran from home in San Fernando. She took to the street and her mom came and chased her down with a Bible in her hand, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I think about sort
Sounds
of
legit.
yeah, like I think about sort of that like inheritance. It's very much a freeing experience, but it's also like a gift, right? It's sort of like this like inheritance I've been allowed to be part of.
Isn't it kind of funny that all three of us have like deep Caribbean roots and experiences and are all talking about the ways that we find belonging but also feel like guests? Like I think that's so striking and what sets conversations about like intra-community conversations about Caribana and Carnival in general, apart from maybe other communities or other festivals or other whatever, is that we are all negotiating belonging in very different ways. And unbelonging is maybe the other key point. I talked about this a little bit, but I'm curious if any of this translates when you are trying to speak to non-Caribbean people about Caribana. Does this nuance come through for you?
I don't talk to non-Caribbean. I'll tell you that.
Okay, so that's one way of navigating this challenge. I mean, does this nuance come through when you're talking to everybody who is Caribbean even?
Okay, I'm joking. I do like. I feel like I'm really like in my explanations. Like I really do try to locate it as like a event for Caribbean people.
Yeah.
Because immediately after, they're looking for me to give them permission
Yes,
to join.
yes.
I'm not the person to ask you because I'm going to tell you no. You can talk to another Caribbean person. Maybe they might be like, yeah, like whatever. I'm going to say no. And maybe that's not the validation you're looking for. That's fine. I'm not here for that. But I do feel like even as a Caribbean person, to your point, I still have to do a lot of negotiating, right? I still have to acknowledge that like it's not like Carnival in Jamaica is like Trinidad 2.0. Like I think the difference is that there's this amazing infusion of dance hall, which I love. It's like the best of both worlds. But then some people will say, well, that's not real Carnival. And to me, I'm like, let me just sit back because maybe you got a point. All I know is that like people have made it really known that it's imported, and I think that that's an important factor to talk about when we're talking about like Carnival in Jamaica, and that it's been made and established into its own thing. Cool. But I think that talking about it this way has always been the way that I've communicated. Even, you know, like you can talk about like what you desire for it to be. And like we can talk about like, because I think it's similar, like how this introduction of like corporate sponsorships or corporate involvement has changed it. I think we share that reality where it's placed. You know, Notting Hill had a specific demographic, and now the demographic that's there right now, they're like, it's too much noise. It's too much noise. And I'm like, girl, do you know where you are? Like, close the window, go out of town for a day, like, do what you need
Book
to
your
do.
vacation,
like,
babe.
yeah,
Like, it's fine.
Yeah.
you know it happens every year. And now there's like this pushback to like quell it, and I think that there are things that we can talk about, but I think that. Yeah, I feel like talking about those tensions, talking about those contradictions, talking about how things have changed, I think that they are so important. Like, those are the conversations. Like, that is the whole conversation.
Yeah. Ryan, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of the narratives that there's always like posts about stormers every year, like after Caribana happens, and the language that gets used is respect. I think, right? Like respect the mass,
Yeah.
respect the legacy that we're sort of contributing to. Because I think when people come in and they disturb and they disrupt and they cause violence or they, you know, engage in sort of things that are taking away from what is supposed to be happening, that becomes the issue, right? And I think for me that's the most frustrating part because there's been so many years where you know, you're on the road and we get halted for like 20 minutes. And I think that's a lot of what people get really frustrated with Toronto Carnival. Because I've never done any carnivals outside of Toronto, so you would know more. But people are always like, like screw this carnival because like we're always being stopped
We're
and
all
like
bunched up and we're there for so long.
we're there for so long, and it's like like you want to cross the stage, like you want to do what you came here to do, right? But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's about gratitude and it's about respect, and as long as people have that, then I think that's what's really important.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. This was so good. I'm sure lots of people, though, will want to know where to find you. They want to know more about you. Where can the people find you on the internet?
So I'm on Twitter. I think my Twitter is Ryan Persadie. My Instagram is a drag account, so don't be too shocked, but it's at tifa.wine. And I'm also available by email, and yeah, I have stuff online, so.
Sharine, what about you?
I am at Sharine with 2 H's, SHHARINE everywhere. That's my home.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for watching. If you would like more Friday in your life, you can follow Friday Things at _Friday Things on Instagram. And you can go to fridaythings.com/subscribe to sign up for the newsletter.
Can't you take